Picture the image burned into everyone's brain from school textbooks and Saturday morning cartoons. A lone figure, wrapped in scraggly animal fur, crouching outside a dark cave, completely cut off from the world. No one to talk to, no one who cares, just survival, one brutal day at a time. That image is so old, so repeated, so deeply wired into how we think about the ancient past that most people never stop to question it. And here's the thing, it's almost completely wrong. The lonely caveman stereotype didn't come from evidence, it came from somewhere much more familiar. It came from us, from the modern world projecting its own anxieties backwards through time. We live in cities packed with millions of people and somehow feel more isolated than ever. So when we imagined our ancient ancestors, we gave them our loneliness. We assumed that because they had less stuff, they must have had less connection, less community, less meaning. But that assumption is now being systematically dismantled by researchers working across a dozen different scientific fields, and what they're finding is genuinely stunning. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I read through these every single time, and it still blows my mind seeing someone in Tokyo and someone in Toronto watching the same video at completely different moments in their day. Last time we had people from Lagos, Edinburgh and Auckland, all in the same thread. The internet does something strange and kind of beautiful when you think about it. Now back to those ancient humans. Because here's where it gets interesting. We don't just have guesses about their social lives, we have actual evidence, and it comes from places you wouldn't necessarily expect. We have bones, not just the shapes of them, but the chemistry locked inside. Isotope analysis can tell researchers where a person grew up versus where they died, sometimes hundreds of miles apart. That's not a lonely person hiding in a cave. That's someone who moved, who traveled, who maintained connections across distances that would take weeks to cross on foot. We have tools showing up in places where the raw materials to make them simply don't exist. Obsidian blades found far from any obsidian source, shells appearing deep inland, nowhere near any ocean. These aren't accidents. They're fingerprints of networks, of exchange, of relationship. We have campsites where the physical layout tells a story about people choosing to be near each other, organizing space deliberately, positioning hearths and sleeping areas and work zones in ways that suggest coordination and shared life. We have art, and not just the famous cave paintings everyone's seen in documentaries. We have tiny carved figures, pierced shells worn as jewelry, ochre mixed and applied with purpose, handprints pressed into stone walls in a gesture that feels almost impossible to look at without feeling something. These aren't the products of isolation. They're the products of people who had enough security, enough support, enough time to make things that mattered beyond just surviving the next hour. And then there's DNA. Ancient genomics has completely rewritten the story of prehistoric human populations. We can now see evidence of interbreeding between different groups, meaning regular contact, regular interaction, probably regular relationship building between communities that once seemed entirely separate. But here's something important to say right at the start. We need to be honest about what we can actually know versus what we're reasonably inferring. The archaeological record is incomplete in ways that are hard to overstate. Organic materials rot, languages vanish. The texture of daily emotional life leaves almost no physical trace at all. So when researchers reconstruct prehistoric social worlds, they're working like detectives, building the most plausible case from available evidence, not reading a diary. Some of what we'll talk about is widely accepted. Some of it is the best current interpretation. And where the picture gets blurry, we'll say so, because that uncertainty is actually part of what makes this so fascinating. What we're really trying to answer here isn't just an academic question about the past. It's something more personal than that. What did connection actually look like for these people on an ordinary day? Not during some dramatic hunt or crisis, but on a Tuesday, if they'd had Tuesdays. Who did they sit near when they ate? Who did they turn to when something went wrong? How did they handle conflict, loneliness, grief, celebration? How did they raise children, care for the sick, welcome strangers, remember the dead? Because the central question underneath all of this is one that matters right now, in your life, wherever you're listening from, whatever time it is there. Human beings evolved not just with big brains and nimble hands, but with a deep biological need for other people. And understanding what that looked like before cities, before screens, before the modern world reorganized everything, might tell us something genuinely useful about what we're missing and why it hurts when we lose it. So let's start at the very beginning, with the word itself, because Caveman is doing a lot of work, and almost none of it is accurate. Start with the word itself. Caveman. It's 2 syllables, and it collapses something extraordinarily diverse into a single, misleading image. One word, one mental picture, one story, and that story gets almost everything wrong before it even gets started. Let's deal with the cave part first. Most prehistoric people did not live in caves, not even close. The best estimates from the archaeological record suggest that the vast majority of human groups across the Paleolithic were living in open-air camps, seasonal shelters, and constructed structures that were sophisticated enough to require real planning and skill to build. Caves and rock shelters do show up in the record, and they show up a lot, but there's a good reason for that. Stone doesn't rot. Caves preserve things in ways that open-air sites simply don't. So what we find most easily is not necessarily what was most common. It's what survived. The people who did use caves were often using them strategically, as shelters from extreme weather, as safe overnight stops during long-distance travel, as places with specific acoustic properties for ritual activities. Several researchers studying cave sites in France and Spain have noted that the chambers where the most famous paintings appear have unusual sound qualities, places where voices echo and drums resonate in particular ways. These weren't living rooms, they were something more like cathedrals, used for specific purposes by communities whose everyday lives were happening somewhere else entirely. Meanwhile, the open-air sites tell a completely different story. At places like Ohalo 2, on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, dated to around 23,000 years ago, archaeologists found the remains of brush huts built with wooden frames and plant materials. 6 of them, arranged deliberately, with hearths and work areas organized around shared use of space. This is a community layout. Someone decided where things should go, and others agreed. That requires coordination. That requires conversation. That requires something we'd recognize as social life. In Siberia and Central Europe, mammoth bone structures have been found from roughly 15,000 to 25,000 years ago. These are not improvised shelters. They're constructed using dozens of mammoth skulls, leg bones and tusks, fitted together in ways that show real engineering knowledge. These took significant collective effort to build, which means the people building them had to cooperate, had to communicate, had to show up at the same place and work toward a shared goal. You don't build a mammoth bone house alone. Then there's the man part of the word and the assumptions embedded there, that we're talking about one group, one culture, one kind of human experience, stretched across hundreds of thousands of years. This is where the myth really starts to fall apart. The term caveman gets casually applied to everyone from Homo erectus to Neanderthals to anatomically modern humans living during the Upper Paleolithic, as if these were all basically the same situation. They weren't. We're talking about different species in some cases, different time periods separated by tens of thousands of years. different environments ranging from tropical forests to Arctic tundra, and different technological and cultural traditions that varied enormously across time and geography. A Neanderthal group living in southern France 60,000 years ago had a completely different existence from a Homo sapiens community in southern Africa at the same period, or an Upper Paleolithic group in northern Russia 20,000 years later. Treating them all as one generic caveman flattens a range of human experience that is honestly breathtaking in its diversity. It would be a bit like describing everyone who ever lived between the fall of Rome and the first iPhone as simply a medieval person and thinking you'd said something meaningful. And this matters beyond just getting history right, because the myth of primitiveness does something subtle and damaging. It creates a mental firewall that stops us from taking these people seriously as fully developed human beings with complex inner lives and complex social worlds. If they're just grunting primitives scratching in the dirt, their experience has nothing to teach us. But if they were cognitively modern humans, which by at least 300,000 years ago they largely were, living in varied environments with varied strategies and varied forms of community, then suddenly everything changes. Then their social arrangements, their relationship networks, their ways of caring for each other and raising children and resolving conflict, those become genuinely relevant data points for understanding what human beings actually need. The mobility piece is worth lingering on too, because it's something the cave image completely erases. Most of these groups were moving, not wandering aimlessly, but following deliberate seasonal patterns, returning to known locations, coordinating with other groups, maintaining what you might call a social calendar written into the landscape itself. Movement wasn't displacement. It was a technology for staying connected, to resources, to other people, and to the wider social world that any individual group depended on for survival. So when we say caveman, we're not just using imprecise shorthand. We're actively hiding something remarkable. And the remarkable thing starts with understanding who these people actually were and how they actually lived. So who were these people actually living with? If you strip away the myth and ask what the social unit of prehistoric life actually looked like, the answer that emerges from the archaeological and anthropological record is both simpler and more interesting than most people expect. The basic unit was the band, a relatively small group of people who moved together, shared resources, made decisions together, and formed the tight core of everyday social life. When researchers try to estimate band sizes from site layouts, hearth spacing, shelter arrangements, and comparisons with modern forager societies, the numbers they arrive at tend to cluster somewhere between 20 and 50 individuals. Some estimates push higher, some run lower, and it's worth being honest about the fact that the evidence varies quite a bit depending on the site, the time period, and the method being used. We're making reasonable inferences here, not reading off a census register. But the general picture of small, face-to-face communities has held up well across decades of research, and it matches what we know about the cognitive architecture of human sociality. We are, at a fundamental level, built for knowing people personally, not as categories or abstractions, but as specific individuals with specific histories. 20 to 50 people is intimate in ways that are hard to reconstruct from the outside. It means every person in the group knows every other person's capabilities, habits, quirks, and tendencies. It means conflict is personal and resolution is immediate. It means the birth of a child or the death of an elder reshapes the entire social fabric in ways that would barely register in a city of 1 million. There is no anonymity in a band. There is no such thing as a stranger in your own camp. And there is very little of the particular modern loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who don't actually know you, But here's what the simple image of a small band moving together tends to miss. These groups were not fixed, sealed units. One of the most important concepts in the study of prehistoric social life is what researchers call fission-fusion dynamics, and it changes everything about how you picture the social world of early humans. The idea is exactly what it sounds like. Groups split apart and come back together in response to changing conditions. In lean seasons, when resources were scarce and widely scattered, a band might divide into smaller family units or even pairs, spreading out across the landscape to maximize their coverage and reduce competition for the same food sources. Then, when conditions improved or when specific opportunities arose, those smaller groups would flow back together, sometimes reuniting with their original band, sometimes temporarily merging with other bands to form larger aggregations. The band you slept with in winter might look quite different from the band you traveled with in late summer. Membership was fluid. People moved between groups through marriage, through kinship obligations, through friendship networks, through conflict that made one situation untenable and another more attractive. The boundaries of the group were real, but permeable, more like a coastline than a wall. This flexibility was a survival strategy, not a social accident. Rigid group membership in an unpredictable environment is a liability. If your band happens to be in the wrong place when the game moves, you starve together. If you have relationships with multiple groups across a wider landscape, you have options. You can move toward where the resources are, and someone there will recognize you and vouch for you and share with you, because you are part of a larger social web that extends well beyond your immediate band. Which brings us to something that tends to get overlooked when we focus only on band-level life. Identity for these people was probably layered in ways we'd recognize. At the smallest scale, the household or hearth group. A few related individuals who slept near the same fire, prepared food together, and coordinated their daily movements most closely. Above that, the band itself, the 20 to 50 people who formed the primary community of shared life. And beyond that, what you might call a regional network, a constellation of related bands who spoke the same or similar languages, shared cultural practices and symbolic systems, recognized each other as belonging to the same broader human community, and maintained relationships across distances through periodic contact, intermarriage, and exchange. Archaeological evidence hints at these wider networks in compelling ways. Distinctive tool styles appearing across hundreds of miles of landscape suggest shared technical traditions maintained across bands. Shells and minerals found far from their natural sources appear in burial sites and decorated objects, meaning people or objects or both were moving along social pathways that connected distant communities. The same symbolic motifs showing up across wide geographic areas suggest not isolated groups, but people who were in some form of conversation with each other, who had a shared cultural vocabulary even when separated by vast terrain. So the social world of a Paleolithic human wasn't just their immediate band. It was a nested set of communities extending outward, from the hearth group to the band to the regional network. Each level with its own particular intimacy, its own obligations, its own forms of identity and belonging. You were a member of your household and your band and your wider people, all at once, in the same way that a person today might feel simultaneously like a family member, a community member, and a citizen of something larger, except that for them, these layers were not abstract affiliations but living relationships, with faces and names and histories attached. Now consider what this structure does to the question of loneliness. Loneliness is not simply about the number of people around you, it's about whether you are known, whether your presence matters to others, whether you have a defined place in a social world that recognizes you. In a band of 20 to 50 people moving through a landscape together, doing tasks together, solving problems together, sleeping near each other, You are embedded in a web of constant mutual recognition that modern life has made genuinely difficult to replicate. The person tending the fire next to you knows your name, your history, your strengths, and your failures. The person watching your children while you hunt knows why you favor your left hand, and what you're afraid of, and which stories make you laugh. This isn't idealized communal harmony. There was certainly irritation and rivalry and resentment in these bands, but the chronic invisible disconnection that many people describe as the defining experience of modern loneliness, the sense of being unseen in the middle of a crowd, that specific kind of suffering is structurally very hard to maintain when your entire life is organized around shared tasks, shared movement, and shared survival with a small group of people who depend on you as much as you depend on them. Fission fusion also means that social isolation was not a permanent condition. If your current situation was difficult or strained, movement was possible. You had kin in other bands. You had alliances you could call on. The landscape was threaded with relationships. The group you could move toward was never more than a season's travel away. None of this means life was without hardship or conflict or grief. It means the architecture of prehistoric social life was built around connection in ways that were not incidental but structural, the direct result of how these groups organized themselves to survive. The belonging wasn't a luxury that happened around the edges of real life. It was woven into the fabric of how everything worked, which means to understand how these people lived, you have to understand not just their tools or their shelters, but their relationships, starting with the most intimate ones at the center of daily existence. At the center of that web of relationships, the most immediate layer of daily life, was something that looked like family. But the word carries enough modern baggage that it's worth unpacking carefully before we use it too freely. When researchers look at family structures across forager societies, living and historical, what they find is not one universal model, but a range of arrangements, each shaped by specific environmental and social conditions. Nuclear families as we understand them today, a mated pair and their children operating as a largely self-contained economic unit, were probably not the dominant form for most of human prehistory. The evidence, both archaeological and ethnographic, points towards something more fluid and more collective. Multi-generational households organized around shared hearths. Flexible residence patterns where a couple might live with her kin for a period and then his. Arrangements that shifted as circumstances demanded. We shouldn't assume that Paleolithic people organized their intimate lives the way a 20th century suburb did, and we shouldn't assume they organized them in any single way at all. Variation was almost certainly the norm, not the exception. What does seem to have been consistent across these variations is something that evolutionary anthropologists call cooperative breeding, and it may be one of the most important things that separates humans from our closest primate relatives. Chimpanzees and gorillas raise offspring almost entirely through the efforts of the biological mother. The mother carries the infant, feeds the infant, protects the infant. Other group members contribute very little. Human children, by contrast, are extraordinarily expensive. They are born helpless, develop slowly, and depend on adult provisioning for years, sometimes a decade or more, before they can reliably feed themselves. No single mother, however capable, could sustain that investment alone, especially not while maintaining her own health and potentially carrying or nursing another infant. The math simply does not work unless other people are helping, and across human societies they do. This is alloparenting, the care of children by individuals other than the biological parents, and it appears to be a defining feature of human social life. Not a cultural add-on, but a deeply embedded behavioral strategy that our species evolved alongside our unusually slow-developing, unusually large-brained, unusually needy offspring. Grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, unrelated band members all contributed to the feeding, carrying, supervising, and teaching of children who were not biologically theirs. Sarah Hrdy and other researchers have argued persuasively that this cooperative childcare system wasn't just helpful, it was the engine that made human intelligence possible. Because children who were cared for by multiple attentive adults didn't just survive better, they developed in a rich social environment that rewarded the ability to read minds, build relationships, and navigate complex social dynamics. Being a human child meant being embedded, from the very beginning, in a network of people whose attention you had to earn and maintain. Think about what that meant practically inside a band. A woman nursing an infant could hand the baby to her mother or her sister-in-law while she went to gather food. The infant, rather than learning to attach to one face, learned to read and respond to many faces, to calibrate its signals across multiple caregivers. The caregivers, in turn, were investing in a child whose survival mattered to the whole group, both emotionally and practically, because that child would eventually become a productive member of the community whose contributions everyone would benefit from. Childcare was not a private domestic matter. It was a community resource allocation problem, and the band solved it collectively. Elders were particularly critical in this system, and this is a piece of the picture that often gets lost when we focus on the athleticism and physical demands of forager life. An older woman past her own reproductive years was not a drain on the group. She was a capital asset. She had decades of accumulated knowledge about plant foods, seasonal patterns, medicinal plants, food preparation techniques, and child development. She had time and motivation to invest in grandchildren and other young band members. The grandmother hypothesis, developed by anthropologist Kristen Hawkes and her colleagues, proposes that the unusual human longevity we see even in prehistoric populations, people living well into their 50s and 60s and beyond, evolved precisely because older women who helped provision grandchildren increased their own inclusive fitness by dramatically improving grandchild survival rates. The long lives of human grandmothers were not a byproduct of modern medicine. They were a selected feature of a cooperative breeding system that needed experienced, knowledgeable, invested older adults to function properly. This multi-age structure changed the texture of daily life in ways that went beyond childcare. A band that included elders, adults in their prime, adolescents, and young children was a richly stratified learning environment. Skills did not have to be reinvented by each generation. They moved continuously from older to younger through direct demonstration, supervised practice, and explanation. An elder who could no longer run with hunters could still teach a 10-year-old how to read a snare, how to identify a plant from its root structure alone, how to predict a river's behavior from the color of its banks. Knowledge was distributed across the age spectrum of the group, which meant the group as a whole was resilient in ways that no individual could be. Shared work followed the same logic. Tasks were organized not on a rigid division by sex or age, but on a pragmatic allocation based on who was available, what was needed, and who had the relevant skill. There almost certainly were patterns, broad tendencies in who did more hunting and who did more gathering, who carried infants and who carried loads. But the ethnographic record of forager societies shows considerable flexibility within those tendencies, and there is no good reason to project modern rigidities onto people whose survival depended on adaptive coordination rather than rule-following. When a task needed doing and a capable person was present, the task got done. What this meant for children specifically was that they were never passive recipients of care, but active participants in the work of daily life from surprisingly young ages, not because childhood was harsh or exploitative, but because participation was how learning happened. A 6-year-old trailing adults on a gathering trip was not working in any burdensome sense. She was acquiring a mental library of plant knowledge that would serve her for the rest of her life. A 12-year-old helping to process a hide was building motor memory and technique under the supervision of people who had done it 10,000 times. The work was the education, and the education was social, hands-on, and continuous. It's tempting to reach for modern ethnographies of hunter-gatherer societies as a direct window into Paleolithic life, and researchers do draw on that comparison carefully. The Kungsan of southern Africa, the Hadza of Tanzania, the Agta of the Philippines, these groups offer genuinely useful models for thinking about forager social organization, cooperative childcare, and the structure of daily work. But they are not time capsules. They are living people shaped by their own specific histories, environments, and pressures, some of which include contact with agricultural and industrial societies. The analogy illuminates without being a perfect mirror, and the honest position is to let it raise plausible possibilities rather than confirm fixed conclusions. What the combination of archaeology, evolutionary biology, and careful ethnographic comparison suggests is this: the family, in the Paleolithic world, was never a closed unit. It was a node in a network. Children were raised by the group and belonged, in a meaningful sense, to the group. Work was shared not as an ideological commitment, but as a practical necessity that also happened to create and reinforce social bonds. The daily texture of life inside a band was built from an endless weave of small mutual investments, each one almost invisible on its own, but together forming a fabric of interdependence so dense that separating individual survival from collective survival would have been nearly impossible. That interdependence had consequences for how people related to each other beyond the immediate family, especially when it came to something as charged and revealing as food. Food is never just food. In a world without refrigeration, without guaranteed harvests, without any of the storage infrastructure that modern people take completely for granted, what you ate and who you ate it with was one of the most politically loaded questions of daily life. And the way prehistoric bands handled that question tells us something profound about how their social worlds actually worked. Start with the basic problem of hunting. A skilled hunter, working with good tools and genuine expertise, still fails more often than he succeeds. Large game hunting, across virtually every forager society ever studied, has a success rate somewhere between 20 and 40% on any given attempt. Some days the group eats well, other days nothing, and the days with nothing tend to cluster. A stretch of bad weather, a seasonal shift in animal movement, an injury to a key hunter, and suddenly a family that was eating fine last week is facing a real shortfall. This variability is not a personal failing, it is an inherent feature of the environment, and it creates a problem that individual hoarding cannot solve, because meat spoils quickly and because a run of bad luck can outlast any individual surplus. The mathematical logic of sharing under these conditions is compelling enough that evolutionary anthropologists have modeled it extensively. When success is variable and unpredictable, a group of hunters who pool their returns and distribute them broadly all end up eating more reliably than hunters who keep everything they catch. You give up your windfall on good days in exchange for a cushion on bad days. The insurance value alone makes sharing rational even before you factor in any social motivation whatsoever. This is why food-sharing norms appear across virtually every forager society we have data on, not because prehistoric people were inherently altruistic in some idealized sense, but because the arithmetic of survival favored it. But how that sharing worked, what rules governed it, who owed what to whom, these questions had multiple possible answers, and the archaeological and ethnographic record suggests real variation across groups and across time. Researchers have identified at least 3 broad models worth distinguishing. Reciprocal exchange is the most straightforward. You share with me today, I share with you later, and over time the accounts roughly balance. This works well in stable bands, where people know each other's track records and can maintain mental ledgers of who has been generous and who has not. Tolerated theft is a different and somewhat counterintuitive idea proposed by Michael Gervin and others to describe situations where a possessor allows others to take food not out of generosity, but because the cost of defending it is higher than the cost of giving it up. If 10 hungry band members are watching you eat, the social friction and potential conflict of refusing to share may simply not be worth it. And then there is obligatory sharing, where distribution is not a negotiated transaction, but a social norm with real teeth, where keeping a large kill to yourself would be not just stingy, but a genuine violation of community expectations, the kind of thing that damages your standing and marks you as someone who cannot be trusted. Most real forager societies probably operated with some mixture of all three, weighted differently depending on context. A small immediate family might share on reciprocal terms with close kin, while distributing to the wider band through something closer to obligatory norms. The proportions shifted with group size, resource abundance, social history, and specific relationships. What is consistent is that the act of sharing was never socially neutral. Every distribution was simultaneously a practical transaction and a social performance. Giving builds reputation. It signals that you are productive, that you are trustworthy, that you are invested in the group's well-being. It creates obligations in return. It softens potential conflicts before they ignite. A successful hunter who distributed generously was not just feeding people, he was accumulating a form of social capital that paid dividends in cooperation, alliance, and support in ways that might not be visible for months or years. The reverse was equally true. People who were consistently stingy, who concealed food or found excuses not to share, became known. Gossip is one of the most powerful social enforcement mechanisms humans have ever developed, and it is very old. In small bands where reputation is everything, and you cannot simply move to a new social context and start over, the cost of being seen as a hoarder was real. Studies of living forager groups consistently find that successful hunters often downplay their kills, that others do the distributing to prevent any appearance of self-promotion, that the social choreography around meat distribution is elaborate and carefully managed precisely because the stakes are high and everyone is watching. This brings us to something that tends to get underemphasized in discussions of prehistoric food procurement, which is the moment of eating itself. Meals in a forager band were not solitary refueling events. They were social occasions, probably among the most consistently social moments of the day. When food came in and got distributed and people gathered to eat, what they were doing was much more than consuming calories. They were comparing notes on the day's events. They were telling stories. They were resolving small tensions from earlier in the day through the simple shared act of sitting together and eating. The hearth, which we discussed earlier as a technological achievement, was also a social architecture. It pulled people into physical proximity, created a shared focal point, and framed time in a way that invited conversation and narrative. Storytelling around food is not a recent innovation. The cognitive and social functions it served, transmitting knowledge, building shared identity, processing collective experience, entertaining in ways that strengthened group bonds, were just as necessary 200,000 years ago as they are now. A meal was also when the day's observations got pooled. What animals had been seen where, which plant patches were ready, where a competitor group's tracks had appeared, what the weather looked like tomorrow. Information that was distributed around a fire while people ate was information that improved everyone's decision-making, not just the person who had gathered it. We should be careful not to flatten this picture into something too harmonious. Food sharing could be a site of genuine conflict as well as cooperation. Questions about who deserved more, whose contribution was being undervalued, whether someone was taking advantage of the system, these tensions were real and ongoing. Evidence from living forager societies includes plenty of arguments, accusations of stinginess, disputes over portions, and occasionally violence connected to food access and distribution. The social rules that governed sharing were not just cooperative tools, they were also frameworks for managing conflict, for giving people a legitimate language in which to make claims and contest unfairness without the situation escalating into something destructive. What we cannot say with certainty is exactly how any specific Paleolithic group managed these dynamics. The details of their exchange norms, the specific obligations that governed a particular band's distribution practices, the precise social weight of giving versus receiving in any one community, those specifics are gone. What the evidence does support is that sharing norms existed, that they were socially enforced, and that they were sophisticated enough to manage the inherent volatility of a hunting and gathering economy across tens of thousands of years. The politics of generosity were not a footnote to prehistoric social life. They were close to its center, woven into every meal, every distribution, every moment when one person handed food to another, and both of them understood exactly what that gesture meant. If food sharing was the political heart of camp life, tools were its nervous system. Every piece of worked stone, every shaped bone, every carefully smoothed spear shaft was more than just equipment. It was the visible tip of an invisible iceberg of teaching, imitation, critique, and practice that stretched across years and across generations. Think for a moment about something like a finely made stone blade from 40,000 years ago. To us, in a museum case, it looks static, a beautiful, symmetrical piece of flint with razor-thin edges and a pleasing shape. Archaeologists can measure its dimensions, analyze the rock it was made from, reconstruct the blows used to shape it. But that finished blade is the end of a very long story, not the beginning. Nobody wakes up one morning, picks up a rock, and spontaneously invents advanced flint knapping. Good stonework is hard. It requires understanding how different rocks fracture, how force travels through the material, how angles, impact points, and even the way you hold your wrist change the outcome. And crucially, it requires making a lot of mistakes. Broken cores, shattered edges, flakes that thin out too quickly or refuse to detach. You do not power through that learning curve alone in a corner. You learn it in a social world. Imagine a teenager in Krog and Nayer's band trying to copy a spear point he's seen the adults using. He has the raw material. He's watched the process 100 times. He swings the hammerstone, and the flint just crumbles. Another blow, and a chunk shears off in the wrong direction. His point is lopsided, ugly, probably unusable. This is where the social part begins. An older hunter or a skilled napper steps in, not to do it for him, but to shape his practice. Move your grip here, strike closer to the edge, rotate the core before the next blow, try a softer hammer. The instruction might be partly verbal, partly gestural, a hand over his hand, guiding the movement, a shared laugh when another flake goes wrong. But underneath the moment is a serious, structured process, apprenticeship. Anthropologists studying living forager groups see this pattern over and over. Children begin by watching and by playing with safe versions of adult tools. They imitate what they see, badly at first. Adults do not sit them down in classrooms. They involve them in real work with scaled risks. A child might be allowed to shape a small scraper long before anyone lets them work on a prized spear point. Mistakes are expected. Correction is constant, but usually subtle. A shake of the head, a demonstration repeated slowly, a try it like this instead. When we see entire assemblages of tools from a site that are made in remarkably similar ways, that is our clue that some version of this process was happening. Standardized blade shapes, consistent angles, particular methods of attaching stone points to wooden shafts with resin and sinew. These are signatures of tradition. They tell us there was a right way to do things, and that people cared enough to enforce it. Standardization is not just about efficiency, it is also about identity. If your band shapes their spear points with a distinctive notch, or prefers a specific way of retouching the edges of scrapers, that style becomes a kind of badge. It marks you as belonging to this group, following this lineage of teachers, inheriting this body of know-how. When archaeologists find different tool styles coexisting in neighboring regions at the same time period, they are not just seeing technical variations, they are seeing cultural boundaries and social networks written in stone. Innovation fits into this picture in a revealing way. New ideas almost never appear as singular strokes of genius in isolation. They emerge from tinkering within these communities of practice. Someone experiments with a different kind of hammerstone and notices cleaner flakes. Someone else tries binding a point with an extra loop of sinew and realizes it holds better on impact. Most experiments fail and quietly disappear. A few work well enough that other people start copying them. At that moment, a private discovery becomes a social technology. Once an innovation proves itself, it spreads, but it spreads along social lines. Ideas travel with bodies. When young adults move between bands through marriage, they carry their home group's techniques in their hands and habits. A new flint knapping style, or a different kind of fishing hook, can diffuse across hundreds of kilometers over a few generations, simply because people are visiting, trading, joining new groups, and being watched while they work. The archaeological record actually shows waves of new tool types appearing and then radiating outward over time, suggesting that networks of teaching and observation were extensive. All of this implies a daily life saturated with demonstration and commentary. Children watching adults weave nets or twist cordage, then being handed a smaller bundle of fibers to practice on. Adolescents trying to copy the exact throwing style of a respected hunter. Peers critiquing each other's work, sometimes gently, sometimes with real edge. That point will snap, that binding will fail, that knot won't hold. Skill was never purely individual. Your competence depended on what you had seen, who had corrected you, which traditions you had access to. There's another layer to this: timing. Many of these skills had sensitive periods. You could start learning basic tool use as a child, but some high-risk techniques, like experimenting with new projectile designs or heat-treating stone in fire, were probably reserved for later, when a person had enough basic competence not to waste critical resources. That staggered access to knowledge created informal hierarchies of expertise. Some people became recognized masters of particular crafts. Others were known for being good enough generalists. Respect, prestige, and even influence in group decisions could partly hinge on who you trusted to make the tools that your life literally depended on. From our perspective, this intricate world of teaching and correction is mostly invisible. Stone, bone, and antler survive. Voices do not. We can pick up a beautifully thinned biface and admire its symmetry, but we cannot hear the conversation that produced it. We don't know who first showed the napper how to control the force of a strike, how many failures lay behind that single success, how many evenings were spent listening to criticism and trying again. What the material record does give us, though, is compelling circumstantial evidence. Long sequences of similarly made tools at the same site suggest decades of stable teaching traditions. Sudden shifts in style hint at new ideas arriving, perhaps with newcomers. Overlaps of different techniques in the same layer point to periods of experimentation or cultural mixing. When you read the stones this way, they stop looking like the products of isolated cavemen and start looking like the output of long-running, socially organized schools of practice. Tools were not just objects that early humans used. They were repositories of shared memory, embodiments of teaching lineages, and passports of group identity. Every sharpened edge and polished surface was a quiet record of someone showing, someone watching, someone correcting, someone learning. In other words, the technology of the Paleolithic was also one of its most important social institutions. And that institution depended on something even more fundamental than stone: the ability to coordinate attention, to signal meaning, to share concepts in real time. Which brings us to the question of how a prehistoric camp actually sounded. If you were dropped into Krog and Near's camp and your ears could suddenly tune in, the first surprise is that it probably wouldn't sound like a bunch of people saying "ugh" and pointing at things. It would sound busy, layered, human in a way you'd recognize instantly, even if you didn't understand a single word. We can't replay an audio recording from 40,000 years ago, but we do have clues. Some come from anatomy. The shape of the basicranium, the base of the skull, affects how the vocal tract is arranged. The position of the larynx, the structure of the hyoid bone in the throat, the size and wiring of brain regions associated with hearing and speech perception. All of these leave traces in bones and endocasts. Neanderthals, for example, had hyoid bones that look strikingly like ours, and their ear bones seem tuned to similar frequencies as modern human speech. Early Homo sapiens fossils show comparable patterns. These hints suggest that, by the time people like Krog and Near were living in Ice Age Eurasia, the physical equipment for complex vocal communication was in place. But anatomy can only say so much. Having a modern-looking hyoid doesn't guarantee full-blown language with grammar, tenses, and nested clauses. Songbirds have no larynx like ours, and still produce elaborate, patterned calls. Baboons have very different vocal tracts but use specific sounds in flexible social ways. Bones tell us that speech-like sound was possible. They can't tell us exactly what was said. Archaeology fills in a different part of the picture. Coordinated hunts using long-range projectiles, fast seasonal moves across hundreds of kilometers, intricate division of labor in camps. These are hard to pull off with only a handful of simple calls. The social worlds implied by the material record, alliances between bands, marriage exchanges, shared ritual practices, put heavy pressure on communication systems to be rich and flexible. So were Ice Age camps full of fully modern language? Probably something close, if we're talking about Homo sapiens. But the path from simple calls to complex grammar wasn't a single on-off switch. It was more like hundreds of incremental tweaks over hundreds of thousands of years. Better control of breath, finer tongue movements, bigger auditory working memory, more nuanced social understanding. Different human species might have been at different points along that path. Whatever their exact linguistic capacity, one function stands out: coordination. Language, in whatever form it took, would have been a tool for getting many minds to act like one. Take hunting. Krog isn't simply waving his arms and hoping everyone reads his mind. He needs ways to specify who goes where, when to start, what to do if the herd turns or scatters. Short, conventionalized calls, left, now, wait, circle, would dramatically increase their success. Over time, those calls could be combined into more complex instructions. You three go around the rocks and wait until I signal, rather than just you there. Childcare is another coordination problem. Multiple adults and older kids are often involved in watching infants and toddlers. Language, spoken or signed, lets caregivers update each other quickly. She ate already. Watch him, he wanders. Don't let them near the fire. When you're juggling several small, mobile, fragile humans around sharp tools and open flames, those little bits of information matter. Planning stretches this out over time. Last night's conversation around the fire about tomorrow's move isn't just random noise. It's temporal coordination. Where to go, when to leave, what to bring, who is responsible for which task. Without some way to talk about time, quantities and conditions, if the river is high, we take the upper path. You're stuck with much more trial and error. But even in a richly speaking camp, language wasn't only in the voice, it was all over the body. Gestures are one of the few universals anthropologists see across very different societies. Pointing especially shows up almost everywhere. Toddlers will point before they can say look. Adults in noisy environments fall back on it instantly. In a prehistoric camp, pointing would have been indispensable, at animals, at distant landmarks, at a tool that needs repair, at a child doing something dangerous. Gaze is another powerful channel. A quick flick of the eyes toward the firewood pile, the water skin, the unfinished spear shaft, combined with a raised eyebrow or a slight tilt of the head, can function as a question or a request. Are you going to deal with that? Should I? Is anyone paying attention? Then there's rhythm. Work songs in many foraging and farming societies are not just for fun, they synchronize movement. If 4 people are hauling a heavy carcass up a slope, chanting or grunting in time makes their effort more efficient. If a group is grinding grain or scraping hides, falling into a shared rhythm reduces fatigue and creates a sense of joint engagement. It's a kind of embodied metronome that keeps everyone coordinated. Non-verbal signals also shine in situations where silence is safer, approaching game, hiding from predators, skirting a neighbor's territory. Hand signals for stop, down, danger, wait, or move there are probably as old as group hunting itself. Many modern hunter-gatherers use rich systems of silent gestures alongside speech. There's no reason to think Ice Age people didn't too. Once you have these channels, voice, hands, eyes, rhythm, they don't just move meat and children around. They start shaping social life itself. Gossip is one of the strongest candidates for a hidden engine of early language. Not gossip as in cruel rumor-mongering, but as in constant, low-level talk about who did what, who helped whom, who can be trusted, who is stingy or generous, who breaks rules. In a small band, your reputation is one of your most important survival assets. People deciding whether to share food with you, whether to warn you about danger, whether to support you in a conflict. Those decisions are influenced by the stories circulating about you. Around the fire at night, after the practical planning is done, conversation probably ranges widely. That time someone almost got trampled by a bison and who saved them. The neighbor who always takes more meat than they should. The newcomer who surprised everyone by killing a deer on their first big hunt. Through these stories, norms get reinforced. He didn't share, and look what happened. She helped the old man, and we all agreed that was right. Gossip, in this sense, is a social regulation system running on words. Humor fits right into this. Laughter is not a modern invention. Chimps and rats have laughter-like responses. Human brains devote real estate to processing jokes and violation of expectations. In a prehistoric camp, jokes are tools with teeth. They can deflate arrogance, mocking someone who boasts too much about a hunt. They can gently correct, turning a repeated mistake into a running gag, so the person feels the pressure to improve without a direct confrontation. They can bond, shared absurdities about the weather, the clumsiness of adolescence, the quirks of neighboring groups. Playful imitation, exaggerating someone's walk, copying the way they complain about the cold, lets people express irritation and affection at the same time. A joke that lands tells everyone that the group's sense of what's okay and what's not is aligned. A joke that falls flat reveals a boundary. In both cases, social rules are being tested and clarified without anyone issuing formal laws. Of course, we have to be cautious. We don't know exactly when fully modern humor, gossip, and complex narrative emerged. The capacity for these things probably built up unevenly, sometimes advancing, sometimes plateauing, potentially differing between Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and other cousins. It's unlikely that one day there were no jokes, and the next day there were stand-up routines around the hearth. More realistically, slowly expanding communication abilities were constantly being recruited for whatever gave groups an edge. Better hunting, smoother childcare, clearer planning, more effective norm enforcement. What we can say is that a silent, purely grunting camp doesn't fit well with the world the archaeological record shows us. Instead, picture overlapping layers of sound and movement, a call to bring more wood, a sharp whisper to a child, a burst of laughter at someone's story, a series of hand signals as hunters rehearse a plan, soft singing as hides are scraped, murmured commentary about who pulled their weight today and who didn't. That's the hidden social life of cavemen at the level of sound and gesture, a constant, intricate choreography of voices and bodies, weaving individual minds into a single, coordinated group. And out of that web of communication, more intense and more personal relationships emerge. Friendships, pair bonds, rivalries, and reconciliations that gave these camps their emotional depth. Those intense personal relationships are where the camp stops being an efficient survival machine and starts looking very familiar, messy, emotional, occasionally dramatic. Start with friendship. In a world where a twisted ankle can kill you, a friend isn't just someone you like hanging out with, they're your insurance policy. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherers see deep, long-term friendships that cut across family lines and even across bands. People exchange visits, gifts, hunting help, and childcare in ways that are not strictly balanced. 1 week you share your meat with me when my hunt fails. 2 months later I watch your kids while you go on a long expedition. Nobody is keeping a spreadsheet. The accounting is spread over years. Something like this probably existed in Krog and Nia's world. A friend might be the person who always steps in when your baby won't stop crying and you're exhausted from a long day, or the hunting partner you trust to cover your flank when you're walking into a narrow ravine, or the neighbor who quietly tops up your woodpile after you've been sick. These bonds blur the edges of nuclear families. Among many foraging societies today, kids have many mothers and many fathers, not in a genetic sense, but in a caregiving sense. An aunt, an older cousin, a close friend of the parents may all discipline, protect, and nurture a child as if they were their own. That spreads risk. If one adult is injured or dies, the child's world doesn't collapse completely. There are other hands ready to pick up the slack. Alliances also matter for big decisions, deciding whether to move camp, who gets to use a prime hunting spot, how to respond when another band encroaches. These aren't just abstract debates. They play out through networks of friends and allies. Who's on my side is as old as human groups themselves. Then there's pair bonding. The stereotype is simple. Caveman sees cavewoman, bonks a rival on the head, drags her away by the hair. Problem solved. Reality was not that cartoonish, and it probably wasn't one size fits all. Across modern foragers and small-scale societies, we see a lot of variety. Long-term monogamous partnerships, serial partnerships over a lifetime, occasional polygyny, informal visiting relationships, marriages arranged to cement alliances between families or groups. It's unlikely that Ice Age people had a single, rigid mating system that looked the same everywhere and always. What seems more consistent is the idea of relationships that last long enough to raise very dependent children. Human babies are incredibly helpless for incredibly long. Cooperative parenting, mother, father, grandparents, siblings, friends, makes that possible. A stable pair bond is a powerful way to anchor that system, even if it's not the only pattern that ever happened. So imagine Krog and Nia not as isolated owners of each other, but as the central pair in a web of support. Nia might rely on her sister and a close friend for help with early childcare. Krog might cooperate tightly with a brother-in-law on hunting trips. Marriage in this world is less about two people retreating into a private life and more about building a bridge between kin networks. Of course, once you have strong bonds, you also have strong feelings when something threatens them. Jealousy didn't arrive with Instagram. In a band of 25 to 40 people, there are no strangers to flirt with discreetly, no new cities to vanish into. If someone is paying too much attention to someone else's partner, everybody sees it. If one person consistently favors a particular friend over other allies, that too is obvious. Resources can trigger rivalry as much as romance does. Who got the best piece of meat from yesterday's kill? Whose children got new clothing first? Who's always borrowing tools and never lending theirs? These small slights can add up in a context where survival depends on a sense of fairness. Conflicts weren't rare exceptions. They were a routine part of life in close quarters. Disputes over hunting mistakes, accusations of laziness, complaints about someone not watching the fire properly, arguments about whether to move camp now or wait a week. Daily frictions are almost guaranteed when the same faces are within arm's reach every day of your life. The interesting question is not whether people argued, but how they kept arguments from blowing the band apart. One basic strategy is avoidance. If two people are really not getting along, the group doesn't need a courtroom to know what to do. They might simply be kept on different tasks. You hunt upriver, I'll go downriver. You work on hides with this cluster of people, I'll carve tools over there. In extreme cases, someone might switch residency to another closely related band for a season or longer. Among modern foragers, this kind of voting with your feet is a classic way to cool things down. Another strategy is quiet mediation. Older, respected individuals, people who have seen many seasons and many disputes, often take on the role of informal peacemakers. They can frame an argument in terms of shared survival. You two need each other alive more than you need to be right about that deer. They can remind everyone of previous cooperation and balanced favors. Their authority doesn't come from written laws, but from reputation and the ability to persuade. Then there are group norms, enforced not by police but by opinion. Remember that gossip from earlier? It's not just entertainment, it's a pressure system. If you hoard food or flirt recklessly or start too many fights, you don't just get a stern talking to. You get stories told about you. Your missteps become camp anecdotes. Laughter can hurt as much as direct anger. Ridicule shows up in many small-scale societies as a surprisingly powerful tool. A boastful hunter might be met with exaggerated eye rolls and joking complaints that his tiny rabbit barely fed anyone, even if he actually killed a huge bison. The point is to cut his ego down to size and keep him from turning success into dominance. For a constantly interdependent band, nobody can afford a tyrant. Fission, the splitting of a group, is the last resort. Sometimes tensions really do build to the point where a set of families decides to peel off and spend a season or a few years elsewhere. This is costly but not necessarily catastrophic. Networks of related bands can stay in loose contact, exchanging individuals, mates, and news, even after a split. The flexibility of being able to join and leave groups is itself a kind of safety valve. All of these mechanisms, Avoidance, mediation, joking, gossip, shifting residence aren't just social niceties. In an Ice Age environment, chronic conflict is a survival risk. A band that's too busy fighting to cooperate will hunt less effectively, share less generously, respond more slowly to danger, and be more vulnerable when disaster hits. Social stability, in this sense, is as much a survival technology as spear points or tailored clothing. Keeping friendships alive, balancing pair bonds with wider alliances, and diffusing jealousies and rivalries wasn't optional extra credit. It was central work, woven into daily life, often handled with subtlety rather than force. Underneath the stone tools and animal bones we dig up today, there was this constant invisible labor, managing feelings, negotiating loyalties, repairing trust. And it's that emotional infrastructure that made something else possible, sustained care for the vulnerable, the sick, and the injured, that leaves its own, very literal marks in the archaeological record. If you strip away the stone tools, the most haunting things we find from this world are bones, not just because they're old, but because some of them tell stories nobody expected cavemen to be capable of. Start with something simple but profound: healed injuries that shouldn't have healed. Archaeologists have found skeletons with shattered legs that knit back together, badly broken arms, crushed ribs, spinal damage. Injuries that, in a world without hospitals, painkillers, or wheelchairs, should have been an instant death sentence. Yet the bone has remodeled, smoothed, grown new tissue. That doesn't happen overnight. We're talking weeks or months of survival. Imagine what that really means in a small, mobile band. You can't hunt if you can't walk. You can't gather far-ranging plants if you can't bend or lift. If your dominant arm is useless, you're not making efficient tools or hauling loads. On a strict, everyone must fully pull their weight at all times model, an injured adult is dead weight. But that's not what the skeletons show. Healed femurs, the big thigh bone, are a classic example. A complete break there is catastrophic. For the bone to knit, the person needs protection from predators and weather, help with moving around or being moved, regular food and water, probably assistance with toileting and basic hygiene. And they need this not for a day or two, but for a long stretch of time. Some Neanderthal skeletons push this even further. There are individuals who seem to have lost the use of an arm, or had severe long-term disabilities from childhood or adolescence, yet lived into their 30s, 40s, even older. One famous case shows a person with damage that would have limited vision, mobility, and grip strength, and the bone growth suggests they carried these impairments for years. To exist in that state and reach a middle-aged or elderly status in Ice Age Europe, something had to be happening around them. Someone was bringing them food when they couldn't go out. Someone was helping them change position, keeping their bedding dry, lifting them over obstacles, or simply slowing the group's pace so they could keep up. Someone was taking on extra work to cover the tasks this person could no longer handle. And not just someone, usually several someones, over and over again. Care isn't a single dramatic moment of rescue. It's tedium and patience. It's feeding a sick bandmate who can't feed themselves. It's staying back with the injured while others go out to hunt. It's tolerating the fact that you're carrying more weight, walking more slowly, burning more calories for fewer immediate returns. From a purely cold perspective, you could say this is strategic. Experienced hunters, skilled healers, or master toolmakers are worth investing in. Even if they're temporarily or partially disabled, their knowledge, memory, and teaching ability still benefit the group. An elder who can no longer sprint after reindeer might still be the only one who can read subtle landscape signs or recall where game passed in a drought 20 winters ago. Care doesn't have to be warm and fuzzy to make evolutionary sense. It can be pragmatic. But when you picture Krog guiding a limping older relative across a river, or Nia patiently feeding broth to a feverish friend, it's hard not to feel that something more than calculation is involved. Day after day of caregiving tends to generate attachment, frustration, gratitude, and grief. Very human emotional landscapes. There's a real debate among researchers about how far we should take this. Is a healed fracture proof of compassion? Not exactly. It proves that there was sustained assistance. It doesn't tell us whether helpers were motivated by love, obligation, fear of social punishment, or a mix of all three. Bones record outcomes, not inner states. The same caution applies when we move from injuries to death. Burials are some of the most striking evidence we have for social meaning around bodies. Across Ice Age Eurasia and beyond, archaeologists have uncovered graves with individuals laid out carefully, sometimes with ochre sprinkled over the body, sometimes with tools, ornaments, or animal parts placed alongside. This isn't universal. Many bodies probably decomposed on the surface, were scavenged, or left in places that left no obvious trace. When we do find a deliberate burial, it stands out. What does it signify? One interpretation is straightforward care, concern about the body's fate, a desire to protect it from scavengers, or to keep the dead physically near the living. Another is practical. Burying a corpse reduces disease risk, smell, and interference with camp activities. Dig a pit, move the problem out of sight and out of reach of predators. Then there's the possibility of symbolic thinking, the use of pigment, the placing of grave goods, the consistent body positions in some sites. These hint that people had ideas about death that went beyond sanitation, maybe beliefs about an afterlife, maybe a sense of continuing identity, maybe simply a way to express, this person mattered. But again, we have to be careful. One spectacular grave with a child covered in beads and ivory ornaments might tempt us to spin elaborate tales about Ice Age religion or tender parental grief. Yet that grave is one data point. Cultural practices can be wildly variable, and a richly furnished burial might reflect the status of the child's family, the politics of a particular group, or even the unique circumstances of that death. Archaeologists argue vigorously about this. Some see every careful interment as evidence of love and ceremony. Others urge restraint, reminding us that ritual can be formal without being affectionate, and that a single unusual burial could result from a one-off event rather than a widespread tradition. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that dead bodies were not always treated as mere refuse. In at least some times and places, people took extra time and effort, digging, arranging, decorating, maybe gathering as a group, to do something deliberate with their dead. In small bands where labor is precious, that is itself a kind of social signal. Put the pieces together, healed bones, long-term impairments, deliberate burials, and a picture starts to emerge. It's not a hallmark card of eternal kindness. Care was probably uneven. Some injured people were surely abandoned when conditions were desperate. Some bodies were undoubtedly handled in ways we'd find shocking. Compassion, like everything human, was likely tangled up with power, fear, obligation, and group strategy. But the fact remains, again and again, the skeletons whisper the same message. People who could not have survived alone did survive. People who could easily have been written off as economic burdens were not always discarded. The dead were sometimes treated in ways that took effort beyond immediate survival. For a creature supposedly defined by brutal caveman instincts, that's a quiet but powerful correction. Under the harshness of Ice Age life, there was room for ongoing care. Under the daily pressure of predators and cold, there was space to sit with the wounded, to carry the weak, to do something more than the minimum with the bodies of the dead. And that capacity to extend effort to those who can't immediately repay it sets the stage for some of the most mysterious traces we find in caves and shelters. Not just how people dealt with bodies, but what they imagined about life, death, and worlds beyond the visible. When we follow that trail, from broken bones that healed to bodies carefully placed in the ground, the next question practically asks itself, what were these people thinking? Because if you walk deeper into some of their caves, past the ash of old hearths and the scattered tools, you hit something that doesn't look practical at all. You hit the walls. Not bare rock, rock that's been turned into a canvas. Horses with arched necks and flared nostrils. Mammoths with shaggy outlines that seem to swell and move in flickering torchlight. Bison, lions, spotted cats. Whole herds flowing along the curves of the stone. Sometimes, tiny handprints. Adults, teenagers, very young children, left in pigment or outlined as silhouettes. And this isn't casual doodling. Some of these images are layered, planned, using natural bumps and cracks in the wall to give animals depth and motion. Pigment had to be collected, processed, carried. Torches had to be made and lit. People crawled through narrow passages, climbed ledges, worked in difficult positions, sometimes returning to the same chamber for generations. Why? We don't actually know, and anyone who tells you they're certain is overreaching. But what we can say is this: whatever was happening here, it wasn't solitary. You don't paint a grand panel of animals 200 meters inside a cave by yourself in secret. You need someone to hold the light, someone to pass tools, someone to mix pigment. Probably someone watching, commenting, remembering what's being added where. The act of making the art is already group behavior. The same pattern shows up in other kinds of objects. Small figurines carved from ivory or stone. Some animal, some human, some with exaggerated features that don't clearly match any living creature. Shells from distant coasts, drilled for stringing. Teeth and claws shaped and polished. Beads made from bone or ivory, hundreds of them in some cases, painstakingly ground and smoothed. Then there are the music-like artifacts, flutes made from bird bone or mammoth ivory with carefully spaced holes, rattles, percussion objects, things that clack and ring and thump. Individually, each of these items could just be decoration or entertainment. Put them together, and you start to see a social technology, ritual. Not ritual in the sense of robed priests and stone temples, but repeated, structured events where the group comes together, does specific things in a specific way, and feels different at the end than at the beginning. Think about what ritual actually does for a small band trying to survive. First, it tells you who we are. If everyone in your group paints similar symbols, wears similar ornaments, sings the same songs at the same times, you're broadcasting an identity. You're making it obvious who belongs and who doesn't. That matters when bands meet at seasonal gatherings, when you run into strangers on a riverbank, when you're deciding who to trust or trade with. Some archaeologists think particular beads, pigments, or patterns might have signaled things like regional affiliation, family line, or personal achievements. Others argue we should be cautious. Status signals don't fossilize neatly. But either way, decorating your body takes time, effort, and cooperation. Someone braids your hair while you sit still. Someone pierces or ties or paints you. You can't fully adorn yourself without help. Second, ritual secures memory. Suppose once a year, when the reindeer move south, 3 or 4 bands gather at a particular valley. People who haven't seen each other for months or years show up. Food is shared, partners are courted, tools and stories are traded. Maybe at that meeting, everyone paints on a certain rock shelter or carves a new figure to add to a growing collection. Maybe they sing an old song that lists all the rivers on the migration route, or all the clans that are present. That repeated pattern locks geography, genealogy, and obligation into a form that's hard to forget. Even the content of cave paintings might be part of that. One interpretation is that the walls record important prey animals and hunting knowledge, behavior, movement, maybe even something like, "This is the place of horses," tied to a real landscape outside. Another view sees them as shamanic visions, attempts to influence game or communicate with a spirit world. A third focuses on the walls as social memory, a record of, "We were here, we did this," that future generations could revisit. We don't have to pick one explanation. Different groups, or even different individuals within a group, could have seen the same images in different ways. One child might learn, "These are the animals our people follow." An adult might experience the same chamber as a sacred space thick with unseen presence. A visiting band might value it as neutral territory where alliances are renewed. Third, ritual coordinates cooperation, synchronized activity, moving in rhythm, singing together, dancing around a fire, has effects on human nervous systems that modern psychologists can measure. Heart rates sync up, people feel closer, they trust each other more, they're more willing to share and to take risks on one another. You don't need neuroscience to guess this. You've probably felt it at a concert, in a stadium, at a protest, in a religious service. Now translate that feeling into a world where your immediate group is your entire safety net. Those bone flutes and rattles weren't just for music appreciation. They were probably tools for binding people's emotions together. Simple drum-like beats keep everyone's bodies in time. Call and response songs make sure even the shy ones are participating. Repeated refrains carry key lines about ancestors, about rules, about territories, into the memory of every child within earshot. This blends directly into storytelling. At night, when the work is done and the little fires are flickering, someone starts a story. Maybe it's Krog, describing the time a hunting party almost got trapped by a shifting river. Maybe it's Nia, telling a tale she learned as a child about the ancestor who angered a powerful animal spirit and brought a snowstorm down on the camp. On the surface, it's entertainment. People laugh at the funny parts, lean in at the scary parts, finish familiar lines together. Underneath, a lot is happening. Myths, big, shared stories about how the world works, are convenient containers for rules and history. Don't camp too close to that cliff becomes a story about a reckless youth who fell and whose ghost still cries in the wind. Share meat fairly or people will stop helping you becomes a tale about the greedy hunter whom the animals abandoned, leaving him to starve. Different researchers emphasize different functions here. Some see myth mainly as social control, a way to enforce cooperation and punish freeloaders without constant fighting. Others highlight its role in coping with fear and uncertainty, wrapping death, famine, and disaster in narratives that make them feel a little less random. Some focus on how myths encode detailed environmental knowledge, migration timings, plant cycles, dangerous weather patterns, in forms that can be remembered and transmitted without writing. Once again, we don't have to choose only one. A single story can do all of this at once. It can teach children how to behave, remind adults of shared obligations, and connect both to a landscape and a line of ancestors. It can make you feel that your tiny band in the cold dark is part of something larger and more continuous than a single lifetime. And importantly, stories are made together. Someone tells, but others interrupt, correct, embellish. No, that's not how my grandmother said it. Kids add bits, test jokes, try out dramatic voices. Over time, the group stabilizes a proper version, but it's always alive, always slightly changing as each generation retells it. The same is true for art and adornment. Learning how to carve a figurine, paint a horse, or braid a particular bead pattern isn't just about manual skill. It's about being invited into a shared imaginary world. This pattern means you're old enough to join the adult hunt. This mark shows you've made it through a dangerous illness. These colors are for our people. Those are for the people by the big river. When several sets of hands work on a single piece, a communal painting, a jointly carved pole, a group dance, belonging gets literally built into the object or event. You are part of it because your effort is in it. In modern life, it's easy to think of imagination as private, daydreams, individual creativity, personal beliefs. In Ice Age bands, imagination was one of the most social things they had. Painting deep in a cave, stringing beads, blowing music through hollow bone, telling the same story for the 100th time. These weren't escapes from reality. They were tools for stitching dozens of separate minds into a coordinated we that could remember the past, navigate the present, and face an uncertain future together. And that shared we didn't stop at the edge of one campfire. It reached out across valleys and rivers, through trade, travel, and friendships with people who might not share your daily life, but did share some of your songs, your symbols, and your sense of connection. If you zoom out from one camp, what starts to appear is something like a web. Not a web on a screen, but a web built out of rivers, ridgelines, memories, and favors owed. Archaeologists first noticed this when they started paying close attention to the raw materials in Ice Age sites. That beautiful, glassy stone someone used to make a blade. In some cases, it doesn't match anything in the local geology. The nearest source might be 50, 100, even 300 kilometers away. The pattern repeats. Marine shells turn up far inland, in places where the sea is only a story told by elders. Red ochre from a particular deposit appears hundreds of kilometers from its origin. Beads made of teeth from animals that don't live in that valley show up in burials there. Either our ancestors were doing weekend marathons for fun, or those materials moved hand to hand through a chain of people. This is where trade comes in. But trade is almost the wrong word if you imagine silent strangers haggling over prices. In small-scale societies that ethnographers can actually observe, exchange is rarely just about objects. It's about relationships. You don't simply buy a shell or a fine blade. Someone gives it to you as part of a visit, a marriage alliance, a debt being repaid, or a ritualized gift exchange. You respond with something of your own. Meat, information, a promise that might be fulfilled now or years from now. The object is a token of a connection. Picture two bands that usually live a week's walk apart. They meet at a river crossing where the salmon run thick every spring. Hugs, shouts, laughter. People who were kids last time are suddenly taller, shyer, or more confident. There's news of births, deaths, arguments, new campsites, strange weather. At some point, the more formal exchanges start. A finely napped point of exotic stone changes hands. It doesn't just say, "Here, have a tool." It says, "I had access to that far-off source. Now I'm letting some of that reach you." A string of beads made from coastal shells is given to a girl betrothed to someone from another band. Her future in-laws see at a glance that she comes with connections that stretch to the shore. Anthropologists call this kind of thing prestige goods, or symbolic exchange. But from the inside, it probably felt like something much more ordinary, being woven into a net of mutual obligation. If your child is wearing the beads my sister made, and my spear point is in your brother's hand, it's much harder for us to treat each other as faceless outsiders the next time we meet. We are entangled. That entanglement expands through visiting and marriage. Most evidence suggests that Ice Age bands were small, maybe 20 to 50 people on a day-to-day basis, but they weren't closed. Young adults, especially women in many models, left their birth group to join another band in marriage. Sometimes that other band would be nearby. Sometimes it would be 2 or 3 seasonal marches away. When that happens, relationships suddenly span distance. Your daughter has gone to live with the people near the big lake. They come to visit during the reindeer migration, bringing news about her children. You send special tools, medicinal plants, or carved ornaments along with them. Maybe, in a lean year, someone from that lake group shows up at your camp with meat, explicitly or implicitly repaying the care you gave their in-law a decade earlier. Over time, these links add up. Bands that never share a daily campfire might still be firmly in one another's orbit because 2 generations back, a man from here married a woman from there, and her brother later married into a third group, and so on. Add regular seasonal gatherings at rich resource spots, rivers crammed with fish, plains where herds reliably pass, and you have moments when multiple branches of this network come together in one place. That's where social mapping kicks in. In a literate society, we map relationships with family trees, charts, spreadsheets, social media graphs. In Ice Age Europe, the map was all in people's heads. Who is related to whom? Which bands have a history of cooperation? Who had a conflict over hunting grounds 2 seasons ago, and has that been smoothed over yet? Who owes meat to whom? Who is reliable in a crisis, and who cuts and runs? When several groups gather, this information gets updated the way you update apps, automatically, in the background, through conversation, ritual, gossip, and the nuanced choreography of gifts. A grandmother points out people to a teenager. Those are your mother's cousins from the Western Hills. Those are the people who helped us when the river froze too early. Those ones? Don't leave your best spear with them. Names, faces, and stories become a living database of the human landscape. This kind of social mapping isn't just trivia. In a dangerous, highly variable environment, it's survival insurance. If your local hunting grounds fail, you need to know not only where the reindeer might have gone, but where you can go that you won't be met with spears. If disease or accident wipes out half your band, you need to know which related group might absorb you and whose internal politics would make that a nightmare. Exotic materials, those distant stones, shells, pigments, are like pins on that map. They show that information, genes, and obligations have flowed along those routes before. How do we know where those materials came from? Modern researchers use something called sourcing studies. They analyze the chemical or isotopic fingerprints of a stone or pigment and compare it to known deposits. With obsidian, this can be incredibly precise. With flint and ochre, it's often more fuzzy, but still useful. If a tool in a French cave has the same signature as a flint source in what's now Belgium, we know someone, at some point, carried that rock, or passed it along, to cover that distance. These methods are powerful, but they're not magic. They depend on having mapped geological sources well, which we haven't done everywhere. Different outcrops can look similar chemically. Erosion might have destroyed the original quarry the tool actually came from. And even when we can trace a stone to a particular region, we usually can't say how many hands it passed through or in what social context before it ended up buried in a hearth. So when you hear that this shell traveled 500 kilometers from the sea, it doesn't mean one heroic hunter made a round trip in a straight line. It could mean that 4 or 5 bands, over decades, each passed it a few days' walk along their usual seasonal circuit. It could have moved as bride wealth, as the treasured ornament of a famous storyteller, as the token given to a child surviving an illness. The physical distance is only the surface. Underneath is a chain of human ties. Put all this together, and the cliché of the isolated caveman starts to collapse. Yes, daily life centered on a small, familiar group. But overlaid on that was a wide, flexible network of distant friends, in-laws, and allies. linked by objects that remembered journeys, by stories that remembered promises, and by brains constantly tracking who was connected to whom across valleys and generations. Their world was sparse in people compared to ours, but socially it was anything but empty. If those long-distance ties were the threads, seasonal gatherings were the knots that held the web together. We don't have invitations preserved in the archaeological record, no calendar stones with "big party here" circled in red ochre. But when you look at how resources are distributed in Ice Age landscapes, it's hard not to see certain places as natural magnets. Think of a narrow river crossing where migrating herds are forced into a bottleneck every autumn, or a cliff edge where, if you know exactly how to drive the animals, whole groups of bison or reindeer can be pushed to their deaths in one coordinated hunt, or a salmon river so thick with fish in a short window that one small band could never process it all before it rotted. Those are not just good hunting spots, they're invitations. If your band knows that, and the band that winters 2 valleys over knows that, and the people from the big lake have their own stories about the same place, you get a pattern. When the animals move, we all go there. At first, maybe it's just 2 neighbouring groups showing up roughly around the same time, carefully watching each other across the river. Over generations, it might turn into something more like a standing appointment. The animals come, the humans converge. Archaeologists can sometimes glimpse these hotspots in the ground. Instead of a thin scatter of bones and tools that looks like one small camp used for a week, certain sites explode with material. Thick layers of butchered bones, hearths built and rebuilt in the same spots, piles of broken spear points and discarded blades, trampled surfaces that could only have formed under many feet over many episodes. In some of these places, we also see unusual things for the region: carved objects, personal ornaments, pigments in multiple colors, bones arranged in deliberate patterns. Not just, "we stopped here for the night," but "this place is special, and we keep coming back." Are these the remains of festivals? We can't say that in the way we'd say, "this is the stadium used for the Olympics." But when you combine rich resources, repeated use, dense debris, and special artifacts, many researchers think you're looking at something more like a seasonal fairground than a random camp. Imagine the mood. For most of the year, your world is your band. 20 to 40 familiar faces. You know every story, every argument, every joke. Then, once or twice a year, the horizon sprouts people. Smoke in the distance, calls answered with other calls, a trickle of visitors that becomes a crowd. Relatives you haven't seen since last winter, the in-laws from the lake, the people you only ever meet at this river, whose names you stumble over but whose dogs you recognize instantly. Strangers with new ornaments, new scars, and new gossip. The practical draw is obvious: cooperation makes big hunts work. Driving panicked animals toward a cliff isn't a one-family job. It takes people spreading out across the landscape, signaling, coordinating, holding positions in real danger. If you pull it off, the payoff is enormous. Far more meat, fat, hides, sinew and bone than any one group could normally access. But that abundance creates a new problem: too much all at once. Processing a whole herd before it spoils is an emergency of a different kind. You need fires going constantly to smoke and dry strips of meat, people scraping and stretching hides, others breaking bones for marrow and grease. Suddenly, extra hands are not just welcome, they're essential. Feasting grows naturally out of that situation. Some parts of an animal are best eaten fresh: the liver, the tongue, the rich fatty bits. When you have dozens of carcasses on the ground, you're not nibbling carefully, you're handing roasted chunks to anyone within reach. Bellies are full and then overfull. People who might be near hunger for much of the year get, for a brief window, to relax into surplus. Sharing that kind of bounty is powerful social glue. If my band stood shoulder to shoulder with yours on the cliff edge, if our kids scraped hides side by side, if we both walked away with stacks of dried meat and a story about the time we almost got trampled together, it changes how we see each other. Next time we argue about hunting rights at the river bend, that memory is in the background. And gatherings are not just about meat, they're prime time for sorting out the slow, messy business of human relationships. Mate finding, for one thing, becomes a lot easier when you suddenly have access to dozens of potential partners who are not your close relatives. Most models of Ice Age social organization assume that people worked hard to avoid inbreeding. You don't need a genetics textbook to notice that children of close kin sometimes get sick and die more often. Seasonal meetups give you options. Parents are paying attention. Those people from the south. They're good hunters. They share fairly. They helped us when the river flooded. Their young man and our daughter seem to like each other. Quiet conversations happen at the edges of the firelight. Promises are made. After the next winter, she will travel with them. When the child is born, you will visit. These aren't arranged marriages in the modern, rigid sense, but they're not purely random romances either. They're woven into a backdrop of alliances, obligations, and careful social calculus. Gatherings are also the perfect moment to repair fraying ties. If two bands had a fight over a carcass months ago, or someone's impulsive act led to a death or an insult, meeting on neutral, abundant ground creates space for ritualized fixing. You can bring gifts, especially fine tools, decorated bones, bright pigments. You can publicly share part of your hunting take with the group you offended. Elders can speak, not just as individuals, but as representatives of a wider network watching. We see hints of this ritual dimension in the archaeology too. At some heavily used sites, certain areas seem to have been set aside for non-ordinary activities. Clusters of animal bones that look more like deliberate deposits than trash. Concentrations of coloured ochre and special objects like carved figurines or decorated antlers. Sometimes these layers sit right on top of thick debris from butchery and everyday life, suggesting that ceremony and feasting were happening in the same general space, perhaps even intertwined. On top of all that, there's the information exchange. Imagine how starved for novelty you'd be if your world for months was just the same few ridges and the same 20 faces. A gathering is like a data download. News flows, where the herds shifted last year, where a rockfall blocked a traditional pass, which valley now feels wrong because the ice is retreating. People compare techniques, how they nap a new spearpoint style, how they stitch boots to keep out meltwater, which plants they've discovered for stomach aches or arrow poisons. Stories spread even faster than tools. A dramatic hunt from one side of the mountain becomes, by the end of the gathering, a story people on the far side will tell as if they'd been there. A strange illness that swept through a distant camp becomes part of everyone's mental map of risk. Even distant groups, who never meet directly, might still end up knowing about each other through second- and third-hand accounts traded at these hubs. When archaeologists find sites with high artifact diversity, different tool styles, ornaments in multiple regional fashions, raw materials from various directions, it strengthens the idea that people from several social worlds overlapped there, at least occasionally. But we have to stay cautious. Dense debris can also come from one group using the same good camp spot over and over. Special objects might mark a burial or a one-off ritual, not necessarily a crowd. A big pile of bones might be the result of a unique, lucky hunt, not an annual event. We are, in a sense, reading the burned and broken leftovers of lives that never expected to be archived. Still, when you put ethnographic examples from recent foragers next to the patterns in Ice Age sites, seasonal gatherings start to look very plausible. They don't have to be festivals in the modern sense. with fixed dates and formal tickets, more like pulses in the social calendar, times when the human web thickened at certain places because the land and the animals nudged everyone in the same direction. In those moments, the stereotype of the lonely caveman dissolves completely. For a few days or weeks, the world would have felt crowded with cousins, allies, rivals, potential spouses, wandering storytellers, clever toolmakers, and children underfoot everywhere. Then, as the animals moved on and the food thinned, the crowd would loosen. Bands would peel away along their familiar routes, carrying new spouses, new ornaments, new stories, and updated mental maps of who mattered in the wider human world. And when the last fires went cold, the place itself remembered. A little more ash in the soil, a few more broken blades, another layer in the archaeological record of a social life far richer than lonely cavemen in a cave. When you picture all those bands crisscrossing the landscape, meeting, trading, marrying, and then peeling away again, an obvious question lurks in the background. Who decided what to do? It's tempting to imagine some Ice Age version of a chief sitting on a rock throne, handing down orders, or, on the flip side, to imagine perfect equality, where everyone just magically agrees. Reality, as far as we can tell, was probably messier and more interesting. Small-scale foraging societies today, the kinds of groups anthropologists can actually observe, rarely have formal leaders with permanent power. Instead, decisions emerge out of conversation, argument, persuasion, and the slow gravity of reputation. There's no reason to think Ice Age people were less subtle. Imagine an evening in camp, the day after one of those big gatherings. The question on everyone's mind, where next? No one stands up and calls a vote. There's no raised hands, no show of coloured pebbles. Instead, the discussion seeps into all the little gaps in the evening. Krog, who's hunted these valleys for decades, mentions that the reindeer usually cross earlier when the spring is this cold. Nia quietly reminds people that the edible roots near the marsh will be at their peak in about a week. An older woman, who's seen more winters than anyone else, recalls a time when following the herd too quickly led to starvation after an unexpected thaw. Over time, a pattern forms. A few people speak more often, or in more confident tones. Others listen, ask questions, point out risks. Someone might tell a story about the last time they ignored a certain person's warning and how badly that went. Laughter, groans, nods. All of this is politics in the small how do we live together sense. Nobody's taking minutes, but everyone is taking note. Leadership in this world isn't a job title. It's an ongoing negotiation between competence, personality, and circumstance. On a long overland journey, the person who knows the ridges, waterholes, and storm patterns best is effectively the leader. If that's Krog, people fall in behind him, ask his opinion, read his face when the wind shifts. In a medical crisis, a bad cut, a difficult birth, a mysterious fever, everyone's eyes snap to the best healer. This might be Nia, or an older relative who knows the plant medicines and has steady hands. In that moment, their word carries enormous weight. If two families are locked in a simmering conflict over a past insult, the crucial figure might be the camp's most trusted mediator, not necessarily the strongest or the loudest, but the one who can listen to both sides, reframe the story, and suggest a compromise everyone can live with. The leader changes with the problem. Best hunter on the cliff edge, best navigator in the fog, best storyteller when the mood is sour and the group needs to be pulled back together, best organizer when dozens of carcasses are on the ground and chaos is one bad call away. This kind of situational leadership only works if the band has strong shared norms about fairness and behavior. You don't need written laws when everyone eats, works, and sleeps within arm's reach of one another. You need habits and a toolkit for enforcing them. Praise is one of the sharpest tools. Bring home a big kill and share generously, and people don't just thank you. They name you in stories. They compliment your skill in front of potential mates. They remember you as the one who helped when my child was sick. That kind of positive attention makes your life easier in 100 subtle ways. Teasing is another. If someone starts to act like a little king, taking the best portions, bragging too much, giving orders instead of asking, jokes appear almost immediately. People might exaggerate his demands in silly imitation. They might mockingly bow when he walks past. They might tell a story about a greedy hunter who ended up alone and hungry because no one would follow him. The point isn't just to be funny, it's to push tall poppies back down to the same height as everyone else. Reputation sits underneath all of this, like a slow-moving current. In a world where your survival depends on the group, being known as generous, reliable, and calm under pressure is better than gold. Being known as selfish, reckless, or cruel is dangerous. You can't easily switch groups. People talk at gatherings. News travels. Who hoarded food in a bad winter? Who hit their partner? Who abandoned a wounded companion? That information shapes who gets invited to join hunts, whose advice is trusted, whose children are considered good marriage partners. At the extreme end of the norm-enforcing spectrum is exclusion. In some modern foraging groups, people almost never physically punish other adults. Instead, the ultimate sanction is to stop cooperating with someone, to ignore their wishes, withdraw help, or in rare, severe cases, quietly move camp without them. For a truly dangerous individual, or in conditions of extreme stress, lethal violence is not off the table. But everything we know from recent hunter-gatherers suggests that most of the time the system works long before it gets that far. Gossip, shaming, teasing, praise, and careful management of reputation do most of the work. Conflict, of course, is unavoidable. Maybe that spear really was yours. Maybe your cousin really did flirt a little too much with someone already loosely promised to another band. Maybe your story about the last hunt conveniently leaves out who actually threw the killing spear. Here again, the group's survival depends on turning hot anger into something that won't tear the band apart. Some disputes probably got aired in front of everyone, with elders or respected mediators nudging the conversation toward resolution. Gift-giving might smooth things. A particularly fine blade, a share of the next big kill. An offer of help at the next camp move. Sometimes the solution is space. One family might travel with a different subgroup for a season, cooling off without breaking the wider network. What we don't see in the archaeological record is anything like permanent palaces, prisons, or thrones. No clear signs of a permanent warrior class ruling over everyone else, at least in the small, mobile bands that dominated most of our deep past. But we shouldn't romanticize this as some perfect egalitarian paradise either. Human beings are fully capable of jealousy, manipulation, and quiet power plays without leaving any obvious trace in the ground. Our best clues come from the pattern that seems to repeat across many small-scale societies. Power is constantly being created by skill and charisma, and constantly being cut back down to size by norms that value sharing, autonomy, and the ability to walk away. In that sense, Ice Age decision-making looks less like a parliament and more like a long-running conversation, stretched across evenings and seasons, anchored in relationships rather than rules. And those relationships didn't just exist within one species. While one branch of our family was working out these delicate balances of influence and fairness, close cousins like Neanderthals and Denisovans were doing something similar in their own worlds, only some of which we can glimpse today. When people hear the word Neanderthal, they usually don't think subtle social life. They think of a lonely brute in a snowy cave, grunting at the darkness. The evidence we actually have points in a very different direction. Start with care. In several Neanderthal sites, we find skeletons of individuals who lived for years with severe injuries or disabilities. One famous case from Shanidar Cave in Iraq shows a man who'd lost most of one arm, had serious damage to his leg, was partially blind in one eye, and suffered other long-term problems. He didn't just survive a week or two, he lived long enough for his bones to remodel, which means years of being fed, protected, and helped. You don't get that in a world where everyone is every caveman for himself. You get that in a world where someone notices you can't walk as far, adjusts the pace, brings you food when you can't hunt, and thinks your continued existence matters. Another Neanderthal jawbone from Spain is so worn and toothless that the person would have struggled to chew almost anything. Yet they lived well into older age. Someone else must have processed their food for them, day after day. That's healthcare, that's patience, that's social obligation. Now zoom out to their technology. Neanderthals weren't just banging rocks together. They made complex stone tools that required planning and sequence, shaping a core rock in specific ways to produce sharp, standardized flakes. They used fire, worked hides, likely made simple adhesives to attach stone points to wooden shafts. They exploited difficult environments, high-altitude sites, cold steppe, dense forests. That kind of adaptation isn't just individual cleverness, it implies networks of knowledge, teaching, and practice, much like the social transmission we saw with Krog and Nia. Then there's the hint of symbolic life. We see Neanderthal burials where bodies are carefully placed in pits, sometimes with grave-like arrangements that look intentional rather than random. There are pierced animal teeth and claws that may have been strung as ornaments. At one site in Spain, Neanderthals seem to have used raptor claws and feathers, possibly for decoration. We also have those cave markings and ochre-stained shells from Iberia that may predate the arrival of our own species, suggesting Neanderthals were already experimenting with body painting and abstract signs. Are we absolutely sure what these things meant to them? No. But it's hard to look at carefully arranged bones, pigments, and personal ornaments and say, no social world here, just brute survival. Denisovans are even more mysterious. We don't have a string of iconic skeletons or big painted caves to work with. For a long time, we didn't even know they existed. Their entire identity emerged from a tiny bone fragment in Denisova cave in Siberia that, when sequenced, turned out not to be Neanderthal and not to be us. Since then, more bits of bone and teeth have filled in the picture slightly. But the real revolution came from ancient DNA. When geneticists looked at the genomes of modern people in places like Papua New Guinea, Australia, parts of East and Southeast Asia, and the Himalayas, they found something striking. Chunks of DNA that clearly came from Denisovans. Neanderthal DNA shows up too, in almost everyone outside Africa, at low percentages. That alone tells us something critical. These weren't isolated, sealed-off species, each living out their fate in total ignorant separation. They met, they interacted, they had children together. Interbreeding sounds clinical, like two lab populations accidentally mixing. In reality, each of those genetic traces represents some kind of actual social situation. Maybe a small band of our ancestors moved into a valley already used by Neanderthals. At first, they watched each other from a distance, the way human groups still do. Over time, maybe they traded materials, stone types that only one group had access to, shell beads, pigments. Eventually, someone married out, or was adopted, or joined another group after a conflict. Whatever the specific scenarios, genes don't move around landscapes by themselves, they travel inside relationships. The DNA also hints at group structure and movement patterns. In some Neanderthal sites, the genetic data suggests small, fairly related groups, something like what we'd expect from tight bands that occasionally exchange mates with neighboring bands. In others, we see signs of long-distance ancestry, implying that at least some individuals moved across big distances over generations, stitching together wider networks. Denisovan DNA in modern Himalayan populations seems to include adaptations for high-altitude living, genes that help people cope with low oxygen. That suggests some Denisovan groups may have been highland specialists, passing on both genes and knowledge for mountain life, just as Krog's people passed on migration routes and fire management tricks. But we have to be honest about the limits. The archaeological record is brutally uneven. Some regions preserve bones and tools beautifully, others erase almost everything. Organic materials, wood, fibers, leather, usually rot away, taking entire categories of technology and art with them. A handful of carefully excavated Neanderthal sites doesn't capture the full range of their societies, any more than a dozen random modern cities would tell you everything about humanity today. And Denisovans? We mostly know them as ghostly signatures in our genomes, with only a few physical traces tied to specific places. Their rituals, their jokes, their arguments, their parenting styles, those are almost entirely beyond our reach, so we're left with patterns and probabilities. Whenever we can see beyond the stereotype, what appears is not a lonely hunter in an empty ice field, but another variation on a social theme, people closely related to us, taking care of injured group members, sharing knowledge about tools, animals, and landscapes, possibly marking bodies, decorating themselves, or arranging the dead in ways that meant something to them. Communities meeting, mixing, sometimes merging, so thoroughly that their DNA still travels in our blood today. We don't know exactly what Neanderthal humour sounded like, or what Denisovan lullabies might have been, but nothing in the evidence suggests that only our branch of the family had rich social lives, and everyone else just sort of trudged around alone until they vanished. If anything, the picture that emerges is of multiple human worlds, overlapping, interacting, occasionally blending, each with its own styles of care, conflict, and meaning-making. Our story of cavemen is really a story of cousins, trading not just goods and genes, but ways of being social in a harsh but deeply connected world. And that brings us back to us, not just in the genetic sense, but in what all this implies for how humans are built to live together today. When you stack all of this evidence together, a pattern starts to crystallize. You have tiny healed finger bones and shattered spines that tell us someone was carried and fed instead of abandoned. You have toothless jaws that only make sense in a world where other people soaked, pounded, or chewed food for you first. You have group-sized hearths and sleeping areas built for many bodies, not for one isolated survivor. You have stone tools and migration routes that are too complex to be figured out from scratch every generation, which means teaching, imitation, and shared standards of how we do things here. You have ornaments, pigments, cave markings, and careful burials that suggest shared symbols and shared stories. You have DNA that proves our ancestors and their cousins didn't just pass each other like ships in the night. They met, stayed long enough to form relationships, raised children who carried blended ancestry, and passed those connections forward for tens of thousands of years. Taken together, this doesn't look like a world of lone hunters doomed to die young in empty snow. It looks like a world of small, tight social webs, families, bands, and larger networks, trying to keep each other alive and make sense of existence under brutal conditions. Does that mean nobody was ever lonely? Of course not. There were outcasts. There were mismatched personalities. There were people who felt unseen in groups that were themselves struggling. There were deaths, rivalries, betrayals, and quiet griefs that never left a trace in the ground. But the baseline of human life, as far back as we can see, is connection. Not perfect connection, not Instagram-worthy, conflict-free connection. Messy, resilient, necessary connection. That picture should make us a little humble, because for all the detail we've explored, we're still squinting at a jigsaw puzzle with most of the pieces missing. Whole categories of their songs, jokes, fears, and hopes are gone forever. Every confident statement about what cavemen were really like should probably come with an asterisk. So instead of treating prehistory as a backdrop for our superiority, we can treat it as a mirror and a question. If humans have always depended on close, face-to-face networks to survive, what does that say about how we're living now? Who are the people in your version of the fire circle? Family, friends, co-workers, neighbors, online communities, who keep you informed, safe, sane, or just less alone? What are your group's rituals, even if they don't look like cave ceremonies? A weekly game night, a group chat that explodes with memes every evening, a religious service, a shared workout, a regular call with someone who really gets you. Those small patterns are not trivial. They're the modern continuation of a very old survival strategy. Humans don't just need food and shelter. We need roles, stories, inside jokes, and the feeling that someone will notice if we don't come back from the hunt. If you've been feeling more isolated caveman lately than member of the band, this isn't a moral failure. It's a mismatch between how our brains evolved to live and the kind of world we've built. But the good news is, the capacity for connection that carried Krog, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and our other ancestors through ice ages and cosmic radiation is still wired into you. You can rebuild fire circles, even if they now look like group texts, book clubs, gaming squads, or neighbors you actually talk to. And if you've enjoyed this journey into the hidden social life of cavemen, it really helps the channel if you tap like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future episodes. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from. What part of the world is your campfire? And maybe share one small ritual or connection in your life that makes you feel a little less alone. Because our ancestors survived by making networks, not just tools. And in a quieter, digital, but still unpredictable world, we're still doing the same thing, trying to find our people and keep the fire going together.